Okay, so if you're anything like me, you've probably binged shows like Mindhunter and been completely captivated by this idea of getting inside a killer's head. But what you see on screen, that's just a dramatization of a very real and honestly a very controversial chapter in law enforcement history. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain and break down the FBI's revolutionary method for profiling the criminal mind.
This number. This is the number that changed absolutely everything. In the 1970s, law enforcement estimated there were about 605 active serial killers in the United States. To put that in perspective, that's almost 3 times the number from the decade before. It was an absolute explosion of what looked like random, motiveless violence, and it created a crisis that traditional policing was just completely unprepared for. And that right there was the question that was paralyzing departments all across the country. I mean, these weren't your typical crimes of passion or robberies gone wrong. No, these were bizarre, they were ritualistic, and they just kept happening. Detectives were totally stumped. So to fight this new kind of predator, the FBI knew they needed a radical new weapon.
When the old playbook doesn't work, you've got to write a new one, right? Well, the FBI's answer was to stop looking only at the physical evidence and to start digging into the twisted psychology behind the crime itself. This idea led to the creation of this small, kind of experimental unit that would go on to change criminal investigation forever.
So in 1972, it became official. The Behavioral Science Unit, or BSU, was born. Its mission? To apply psychology and social sciences to the country's most disturbing and baffling cases. This, right here, this was the official beginning of what we now call criminal profiling.
And things took off fast. I mean, really fast. Just 4 years after the BSU was founded, agents started this groundbreaking and, let's be honest, pretty chilling research project. They started going into maximum security prisons to interview the very monsters they were trying to catch. By 1979, they'd built their first database from talks with 36 of the most notorious offenders. And by 85, this whole operation was formalized with the creation of the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime. So what was the thinking here? What was the core idea of the BSU? Well, it was actually pretty simple, but profound. If you want to understand an artist, you study their art. And for agents like John Douglas and Robert Ressler, the crime scene was the canvas. And to really understand it, they had to talk to the artist. They had to sit face to face with these killers and basically ask them, why? Why did you do this? Now, through these intense interviews, they started to develop some key concepts. The first one is modus operandi, or MO. The easiest way to think about the MO is as the how-to guide for the crime. It's the practical, learned stuff, how the killer picks a victim, how they control them, and how they get away. And it's dynamic. It can change. A killer gets better with practice, or they learn from their mistakes. But then you have the signature. And this is the why. These are the behaviors that aren't actually needed to pull off the crime, but they are absolutely essential for the killer's psychological satisfaction. It's their personal ritual, the thing that comes from their own violent fantasies. And while the MO can change, this signature, that's a deep-seated need that tends to stay the same. This slide really lays it out perfectly. MO is all about function, how to get the job done and not get caught. Signature is all about fantasy, fulfilling some deep psychological compulsion. So an offender might change their weapon or the type of place they attack. That's their MO evolving. But the ritualistic thing they do to the victim, that's their signature, that often stays consistent. Getting this distinction is absolutely fundamental to understanding profiling. Okay, so from all this research, the BSU developed its first major framework for classifying these killers. Based on the clues left at the crime scene, or sometimes the lack of clues, they came up with the theory that offenders could generally be sorted into 2 main buckets, organized and disorganized. And this work wasn't just for, academic papers. It was forged into a formal process that could be used in real active investigations. It's called Criminal Investigative Analysis, or CIA, and it basically turned the art of interpreting a crime scene into a step-by-step method. And the process is incredibly structured. It all starts with, number 1, profiling inputs. You gather every single piece of data you can get your hands on. Crime scene photos, autopsy reports, the victim's background. Then you move to decision process models, where you try to organize all that chaos to spot patterns. Step 3, crime assessment, is where you reconstruct the event to really understand what the offender and victim did. And all of that leads to step 4, the criminal profile, a working hypothesis about the bad guy's age, habits, even their personality. Finally, that profile is used to guide the investigation, and once a suspect is caught, you check the profile against them in the apprehension phase. But here's the thing, while the process looks very scientific and methodical, its reliance on the agent's intuition sparked a massive debate. The academic and scientific communities started asking some really tough questions, like, is this actually a science, or is it just a very, very educated guess?
This quote really just nails the heart of the critique. The FBI's method came from the experience and gut feelings of a handful of agents. And while their experience was no doubt incredible, it wasn't scientific in a way that you could measure or replicate. You couldn't test it. In a way, it was an art form, and science tends to be very skeptical of art.
And the criticisms got pretty specific. First off, the entire foundation was built on interviews with just 36 offenders. That's a tiny sample, and it wasn't diverse at all. They then used that data to make huge generalizations about all killers. The method wasn't peer-reviewed, and a lot of academics argued that the whole organized/disorganized model was way too simple, forcing complex people into just two neat little boxes. At its core, it was seen as subjective art, not objective science. So, this brings us to the million-dollar question. Did it actually work? A key study in 1984 by Pinizzato looked at a bunch of cases where profiling was used. Now, of the 88 solved cases they looked at, police said the profile was helpful, but the profile directly helped identify the actual suspect in only 15 of those cases. This suggested that, yeah, profiling was a useful tool for pointing detectives in the right direction, but it was rarely the smoking gun that actually cracked the case.
But, and this is a big but, despite all these valid critiques, the BSU's work was still revolutionary. It completely changed the game. It forced law enforcement to start thinking behaviorally, and it basically kicked off a whole new field of study. In fact, all that pushback from academics led directly to the development of new, more scientific approaches.
And this slide really shows the two paths that emerged. Over in the UK, a psychologist named David Cantor developed a totally different approach called investigative psychology. Instead of relying on an agent's gut feeling, IP is all about empirical data and psychological theory. It uses powerful statistical analysis on huge crime databases to find real, verifiable patterns. It's a move away from gut instinct and toward evidence-based probability.
And the FBI itself has changed a ton too. Today, their role is much broader. The modern behavioral analysis unit doesn't just do profiling. They provide what they call behavioral analysis, which includes helping develop interview strategies and, maybe most importantly, doing threat assessments to try and stop violence before it even happens. It's less about creating that one magical whodunit profile and way more about providing a whole range of behavioral support.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating question, especially for the future of your careers. In this age of DNA, big data, and even artificial intelligence, is there still room for that uniquely human skill of intuition? Can a machine or an algorithm ever truly understand the why behind a killer's signature? That's the tension that continues to define both the art and the science of criminal profiling.